Imagine the magnificent palaces of ancient Japan before your eyes. Gilded doors, rooms draped in silks, water channels flowing quietly through the gardens, and servants working with disciplined precision at every corner. From the outside, this glorious world seemed like a dream. But behind these walls, there was a much darker truth that no one spoke of openly and that historical records often ignored. That truth was the life of the male concubines. They were young, often torn from their families in childhood, selected for the court, trained, and then never again allowed to taste freedom. For those around them, entering the palace was considered a great honor. It meant a connection to the imperial household, to the nobility, to power, and it brought prestige to the family. But in reality, these young lives, behind the ostentatious doors, became unending bondage. Male concubines were used not only to serve, but also to satisfy their master's desires. Their bodies and their spirits were not their own. Sometimes the palace lords, sometimes high-ranking generals, sometimes even the emperor himself. Each of them regarded these youths not as human beings, but merely as instruments. For these young men, life at court was full more of pain and fear than of splendor. The slightest mistake was seen as disobedience and harshly punished. Punishments often included beatings, torture, and even disappearances that ended in death. They were both visible and invisible. Everyone at court knew of their existence, but no one bothered to ask about their feelings or their suffering. By day, a male concubine had to move like a silent shadow. He had to keep his eyes lowered and live as if only permitted to breathe in the presence of his masters. But at night, in the shadows, the heaviest duties began. Concubines who disobeyed, showed displeasure, or spoiled their master's pleasure often did not live to see the morning. So their world consisted of staying constantly on guard, living in fear, and trying to survive. From the outside, male concubines were part of the palace. They were adorned, dressed with care, bedecked in jewels, and sometimes trained in the arts and music. But beneath all that display lay a deep tragedy. Their smiles were false, their words born of compulsion, and their lives had become playthings in the hands of others. The story of the male concubines reveals not only individual dramas, but also the social structure of the time. Lives sacrificed for the desires of the powerful show us not only the dark face of the court, but also what power can drive people to do to one another. In this documentary, we will take you into that shadowy corner of history. We will examine in depth how male concubines were chosen in ancient Japan, the tortures they endured, how they struggled to survive within the palace, and the pains they had to bear. Their story is not merely an echo of the past, but a universal lesson that urges us to reflect on freedom, dignity, and humanity. Most male concubine stories began when they were still children. In Japan, the process of selecting concubines for the imperial palaces and noble families was governed by strict rules. Those chosen to serve in the shadowy corridors of the court were not picked at random. They were found through careful attention to specific standards. Officials would travel from village to village, inspecting young boys. Those with particularly delicate facial features, slender physiques, and quiet, obedient temperaments were favored. The palace wanted concubines who were not only pleasing to the eye, but also easy to control. Children were preferred, since they were more likely to submit without resistance. For families, this selection process was often portrayed as a source of pride. "Your son will enter the palace. He will serve the empire," they were told. For poor households, this seemed like a great opportunity, as a connection to the court could bring both prestige and financial security. But in reality, most families did not know what their sons would truly endure, and even if they did, they lacked the power to refuse. A summons from the palace was more like a command. From the moment the chosen boys were taken from their families, their lives changed irreversibly. In those farewells, there were often mothers' tears and fathers' silent helplessness. The children themselves rarely understood where they were going or what awaited them. By the time they reached the palace, their old lives were already over. The first stage was training. The palace was a place of obedience and silence, and male concubines were brought under strict control from the very beginning. They were taught how to walk, how to speak, how to look. They were forbidden from raising their heads and making eye contact. Speaking without permission was forbidden. Even smiling or crying was often prohibited. Concubines were expected to behave less like people and more like shadows. Training went beyond discipline. They were also taught music, dance, poetry, and literature. The palace lords wanted concubines who could not only obey, but also entertain. So the boys were forced to learn the arts, to speak beautifully, to sing, and to act gracefully. Yet these skills were never meant to enrich their own lives, but to heighten the pleasure of their masters. Over time, these children began to lose their sense of self. They were constantly reminded, "You no longer belong to yourself. You are property of the palace." That phrase echoed in their minds like a chain. Many were forced to silence their inner resistance, for rebellion always led to punishment. The harshest part of their training was learning to be obedient with their bodies. Concubines were prepared to fulfill every desire of their masters. This was often a source of deep shame and pain, but since many were taken at such a young age, they were drawn into this system before they could even fully understand what was right or wrong. For concubines, the palace was both a prison and a stage. They were expected always to be ready, always beautiful, and always silent. There was no freedom, no family, no future. Their only reality was the captivity they endured behind the palace's gilded doors. Thus, the first stage of a male concubine's life was complete. The loss of childhood, the stripping away of identity, and the forced entry into a new life within the palace's shadowed walls. This was not truly a beginning, but an ending, because their bond with freedom was severed from the very first day. From the moment they stepped inside the palace gates, life for male concubines was no longer ordinary. It was a system built entirely on rules and obedience. In their world, there was no freedom, no personal choice, and at times, even breathing seemed like something that required permission. Every movement, every word, every glance carried meaning, and if misinterpreted, could bring severe punishment. Their days did not begin with the first rays of sunlight, but with the strict discipline of the palace. Often their nights stretched long into the hours of service for their masters, leaving them with little sleep. Yet, no matter how tired, they had to rise at dawn. Even climbing out of bed demanded silence. The creak of a floorboard, a breath taken too loudly, or the faintest sound that woke their superiors could be cause for punishment. In the early morning, their first duty was preparation for their masters. Some concubines arranged clothing, some prepared meals, others cleaned the rooms. These tasks may have seemed ordinary, but each was a test. A robe folded incorrectly, food salted too heavily, or a single speck of dust on the floor. Such small mistakes could lead to consequences that changed their lives forever. Thus, concubines lived constantly on edge. Though their daily tasks seemed mundane, each second carried the weight of immense stress. One question echoed endlessly in their minds: "Will I make a mistake today?" Inside the palace, everything was splendid. Golden doors, walls adorned with paintings, silk curtains. But for the male concubines, this grandeur meant nothing. They were not there to enjoy luxury. They were the invisible bearers of it. The silks, the golden plates, the jewels that passed through their hands were never theirs. They were merely shadows that enhanced the brilliance of others. Obedience was the essence of their existence. The most valued quality of a concubine was how quiet and submissive he could be. Carrying out commands without hesitation, bowing without resistance, keeping a face void of expression, these were the only ways to survive. Defiance or the slightest hint of resistance often ended in brutal beatings or even death. To live, they had to learn to suppress their very selves. A crucial part of daily life was to be invisible. A concubine had to be present in a room yet unnoticed, always ready but never intrusive. When his master was thirsty, he was to offer wine before being asked. If a robe slipped, he was to adjust it silently. But in doing so, he could never meet his master's eyes, never draw attention to his presence. It was an impossible balance, to be both visible and unseen. Their duties extended beyond service. Concubines were expected to master the arts, music, poetry, dance. Their masters demanded not only obedience but also entertainment. A well-sung song or a graceful dance could momentarily increase a concubine's value in his master's eyes. Yet even this value was fragile, praised one day, punished the next for the smallest mistake. There was never any security. While the days were filled with unrelenting service, the nights were heavier and far more painful. At night they were forced to satisfy the desires of their masters. This was the deepest source of shame and burden. Many were drawn into this life before they were old enough to even understand what was happening. Resistance was impossible. It meant death. Survival demanded silent submission. A day in the palace, from the outside, appeared calm and magnificent. But for the concubines it was a chain of torment, each link binding them tighter. Each morning began in fear, each night ended in anguish. And always in their minds the same question lingered: will I ever be free? But that hope of freedom was usually far beyond reach. The palace gates welcomed those who entered, but rarely allowed anyone to leave. From the day male concubines stepped through those gates, they had in truth stepped into a captivity that often lasted a lifetime. Thus their daily existence became a cycle, seemingly orderly, but in truth a constant rhythm of fear and suffering, obedience, silence, invisibility. These were the greatest lessons the concubines learned within the palace's gilded walls, the only keys to survival. The life of male concubines within the palace was a nightmare that unfolded constantly in the shadow of magnificent and opulent walls. The fear and pressure they experienced in their daily routines were often invisible, yet the impact of this oppression left deep scars on their souls. In their world, the smallest mistake, a moment of anger, negligence, or misinterpretation could bring consequences more terrifying than death. Rules in the palace were strict, orders were unquestionable, and even thoughts of rebellion were forbidden. If a concubine spoke at the wrong time or misread his master's gaze, he could face severe physical punishment. These punishments targeted not only the body, but the spirit as well. Even before experiencing beatings, hunger, or prolonged isolation, a concubine was aware that his very existence was constantly monitored, instilling a persistent, internalized fear. Beatings were the most common form of punishment. Strikes from thin bamboo rods often left deep welts, sometimes reaching the bone. Some were forced to kneel motionless for hours or stand on cold stone floors through the night. But the purpose of this torture was not merely to inflict pain. It was to break the spirit, to create a mind that was both obedient and fearful. The palace masters used these methods to assert their power and maintain absolute control over the concubines. Some punishments were public. Being scolded or beaten in the great halls in full view of other concubines served as a lesson. All concubines learned the price of mistakes and disobedience, forced to walk the fine line between fear and discipline. Yet the most terrifying punishments were the secret ones. Some concubines disappeared without warning. No one questioned where they went or what had happened to them. These disappearances were among the palace's most ruthless methods, carried out in silence. Nightfall brought the heaviest burdens. Serving their master's private desires was both a physical and psychological torment for the young concubines. Resistance was impossible, as it meant death or severe punishment. Thus, most concubines learned to submit silently to survive. Sometimes they were used purely as objects of pleasure, other times humiliated as a demonstration of power. These actions inflicted lasting trauma on their spirits. Within the palace, concubines were also entangled in complex rivalries with one another. Some envied others in hopes of gaining favor, while some stayed quietly in the background simply to survive. Trust and friendship were nearly non-existent. Life was a constant struggle to endure, never knowing whose turn it would be next. The realities behind disappearances were often kept secret. The palace walls silently witnessed torture and death. Rumors whispered that some concubines had fallen victim to their master's wrath, while others were quietly eliminated in hidden corners of the palace. These stories fueled constant fear among those who remained, as none could know when it might be their turn. Psychological torment was an inseparable part of palace life. Concubines could be confined to their rooms for days, forbidden to speak to anyone. Long periods without light, without communication, or without activity slowly eroded their young spirits. Many eventually forgot their own identities, becoming shadows who breathed only to survive. The greatest fear for male concubines was silent erasure. One day they might be favored, rewarded by their master. The next day, a misplaced glance or a delayed task could result in punishment or disappearance. This uncertainty kept their minds in a constant state of anxiety and dread. The palace walls had consumed their freedom, always watching, always waiting. Some concubines, in order to survive, gradually shut themselves off entirely. They suppressed their emotions, stopped dreaming, and nearly lost all hope of freedom. Their spirits became entwined with the dark shadows of the palace day by day. Freedom, family, and identity were distant memories. Their only reality was the relentless cycle of fear and suffering they endured every day. The dark side of the palace was a tragedy that unfolded quietly behind golden doors and silk curtains. To an outsider, it appeared magnificent and orderly, but for male concubines, it was a prison of torture, disappearance, and despair. These truths, often overlooked in history books, were etched into their souls and echoed silently within the palace's stone walls. From the outside, the palace appeared merely as a magnificent structure and an orderly living space. Yet behind its walls, an invisible battle and a complex web of relationships unfolded. Male concubines were not merely passive figures within this network. To survive, they had to constantly employ strategy, vigilance, and psychological resilience. One of the palace's most intricate and perilous games was the relationship between male and female concubines. Female concubines could be both a threat and a potential ally. Some would not hesitate to belittle male concubines to gain power in the competition for their master's favor. They skillfully exploited the men's weaknesses, fears, and vulnerabilities, manipulating them to secure their own positions. A glance, a word, or a gesture could be used as a tool to survive and assert superiority within the palace. Male concubines were not entirely passive either. They learned to strategize to survive. Some collaborated with female concubines, while others preferred to remain silent and invisible to avoid drawing attention. Yet these relationships were fragile. Someone who seemed a friend one day could become a rival the next. Nothing in the palace was permanent, and trust was almost non-existent. The hidden competition extended beyond female concubines. Among the males themselves, a constant struggle persisted. Some sought to become the master's favorites, while others simply aimed to survive. Each concubine tried to identify the weaknesses of others and use them for personal advantage. While this could provide short-term gains in the palace's complex power dynamics, it was also highly dangerous. Any misstep could quickly trigger the master's wrath, leading to severe punishment. Female concubines constantly observed the male concubines, exploiting opportunities to manipulate them. Some envied their growing favor in the eyes of the masters and schemed to block it. This created continuous pressure and deeply affected the male's psychological state. Every movement had to be calculated, every word measured, every gesture weighed. The palace's social games were not limited to visible actions. They were also conducted through silent agreements, eye contact, subtle gestures, and behavior. Male concubines could, at times, form brief alliances with a female concubine, which might reduce the risk of punishment or provide a temporary sense of relief. But these relationships were delicate. A friend one day could become an enemy the next, turning into a threat within the palace's shifting power dynamics. To survive, male concubines had to constantly develop strategies. Which gesture, which glance, which word should be shown, to whom, and when? These decisions could mean the difference between life and death. A misunderstanding, a small mistake, even a single glance, could determine a concubine's fate. The palace's intricate social structure deeply affected the concubine's mental world. They lived under constant pressure, forced to suppress their identities and remain alert at all times. Every look, every word, every action had to be carefully planned. Opportunities for self-expression were virtually non-existent. These social games encompassed not just outward elegance, but an ongoing internal struggle for survival. This complex, ever-changing network of relationships left permanent scars on the concubine's psyches. Outwardly obedient, silent and graceful, they internally carried constant anxiety, fear and loneliness. Nothing in the palace was stable. Each day brought new challenges, new tests, and required a strategy to survive. Secret rivalries, manipulations, and alliances formed the core of a male concubine's life. They did not merely serve their master's desires, they struggled to maintain their existence within the palace's intricate power balance. Every day brought a new game, a new danger, and more often than not, these schemes worked against them. Relationships with female concubines could mean temporary security or deadly traps. Therefore, every movement, glance, and word had to be carefully calculated. The smallest mistake could mark the beginning of a lifelong tragedy. Thus, the social life of male concubines in the palace, while appearing orderly and elegant, was in reality a relentless struggle requiring constant vigilance, calculation, and psychological endurance. Their existence was not only about submitting to their master's desires, but also about staying alert in the palace's dark and merciless games, fighting to survive every single day. The palace's grand stone walls and gilded doors might have seemed, from the outside, to offer only a life of splendor. But for the male concubines, this magnificence was like a cage. Outwardly seen as graceful, silent, and obedient figures, these young men carried within them souls shaped by trauma, battling their inner worlds every day. They had been torn from their families at a young age, deprived of freedom, and thrust into the palace's merciless system while still children. Psychological collapse was an inseparable part of their lives. The young men had to suppress their emotions, deny their desires, and silently hide their thoughts. In the palace, laughing, crying, or showing anger was a luxury they could not afford. Such expressions were seen as risks that could invite immediate punishment. Every movement, every glance was scrutinized, and even the smallest mistakes were met with harsh penalties. Over time, this constant pressure created a state of internalized fear and insecurity, quietly eroding the concubine's spirits. Inner conflicts raged like storms in the minds of the male concubines. On one side was the instinct to survive, on the other, suppressed anger and a longing for freedom. This triad collided continuously, often resulting in feelings of helplessness. Resistance carried the risk of death, while submission meant the erosion of their identity. For survival, many concubines were forced to suppress their very selves. Gradually, male concubines began to lose their sense of self. Families, past lives, and childhood memories became distant illusions. Cut off almost entirely from the outside world, they struggled to survive by suppressing their desires, joys, sorrows, and hopes. This created a profound psychological tragedy, fragmenting their identities. The palace's harsh order also prevented male concubines from forming meaningful emotional connections. Friendships were short-lived, and trust was nearly non-existent. Even if a concubine approached another, the bond often quickly dissolved, ending in betrayal, misunderstanding, or intervention from their masters. Consequently, male concubines learned to hide their emotions, remain alone, and protect their inner world. Every friendship could become a potential trap. Another dimension of inner conflict was the question, who am I? They had become shadows, unable to live their own lives or express their own desires. Serving their master's wishes and adhering to the palace's rigid rules shaped their entire existence. This fostered a continual sense of identity loss and loneliness. They lived in a constant struggle between their true selves and the roles they were forced to play within the palace. Some male concubines tried to fill the void inside by daydreaming. Yet dreams often became a source of pain because imagining freedom or expressing desire made them vulnerable to punishment and wrath. Daydreams were both an escape and a danger, a fleeting reflection of a normal life that could never be realized, deepening their psychological suffering. Over time, the concubines developed defense mechanisms to protect their minds, suppressing emotions, isolating their inner world, making themselves invisible. These were survival strategies. Yet these strategies also deepened their loneliness, further disconnecting them from their identities. Living a life that denied their own wishes and suppressed their own selves exhausted the young concubines both physically and emotionally. Male concubines had to appear flawless and obedient at all times. Silence, grace, and compliance were their masks of survival. Beneath this mask, however, lay a constant wave of fear, anxiety, and despair. They had to remain vigilant and cope with their internal suffering at every moment. Nothing in the palace was stable. Every day presented a new test. Every moment required a struggle to survive. Psychological pressure sometimes approached the brink of madness or depression. Some concubines fully isolated themselves, severing all connections with the outside world. They screamed silently, conversed only within their minds, and reached no one. This was the palace's most invisible yet profound tragedy. Young souls lost within themselves, forgetting their identities and experiencing freedom only as a distant dream. These deep inner conflicts permeated every aspect of male concubines' lives. Beyond daily service and obedience, they had to constantly protect their identities and mental health. Every glance, word, and action had to be carefully considered. A small mistake in the palace could result in both physical and psychological disaster. Thus, the mental world of male concubines, hidden beneath outward elegance and silence, was filled with profound tragedy, identity loss, and relentless psychological pressure. They were both servants submitting to their masters, desires and shadows, who had detached from their own selves, hiding their souls. The years spent within the palace's stone walls left permanent marks on their inner lives, nearly erasing any hope of freedom or a sense of self. The lives of male concubines were a tragedy trapped within the palace's stone walls. Daily submission, constant obedience, and the suppression of emotions often drove them to despair. Yet some young men never relinquished the dream of freedom, even in this dark world. Visions of escape and liberty were the only things that kept their spirits alive. Even dreaming was risky, for the slightest emotional weakness could be noticed and punished. Still, male concubines would sometimes close their eyes and imagine themselves in distant lands, beside their families, living free and peaceful lives. These fantasies offered both solace and a brief reprieve from the weight of their suffering. For some concubines, escape was not just a dream, but a carefully planned strategy. Yet fleeing the palace was nearly impossible. Corridors were filled with guards, doors were locked, and the palace grounds were heavily secured. Every step carried both physical and psychological risks. One wrong move could lead to punishment or even death. Escape plans required long periods of observation, secret signals, and careful coordination. Male concubines sometimes communicated silently, noting which guard patrolled at what hour, waiting for the smallest opportunity. Some attempted to slip away through hidden spots in kitchens or cleaning areas to reach less guarded locations. Yet most plans failed. Those caught were punished harshly, and some simply vanished without a trace. Rarely, a concubine would succeed and flee the palace. Such escapes were not only physical, but also spiritual victories. Those who escaped could finally reclaim years of suppressed emotion, express themselves, and experience the taste of freedom. Yet these stories existed mostly as whispered rumors within the palace. The majority were caught and never returned. Freedom, once attained, was as precious as a dream. But stepping into the outside world brought new challenges and dangers. Survival strategies learned within the palace did not always apply to life beyond its walls. Freedom could heal their spirits, but rebuilding a life was never easy. Escape stories served as both hope and warning for the remaining concubines. They showed that freedom was possible, yet reminded everyone of the severe consequences of failure. Only the brave and strategically clever could attempt such a feat. Dreams of liberty formed the foundation of the male concubine's mental resilience. Though the palace's dark walls, punishments, and tortures sought to enslave them, a spark of hope remained. Sometimes it appeared as a fleeting glance, the thought of an escape plan, or the vision of a distant future. Some concubines, upon leaving the palace, managed to build new lives. They found refuge in villages, assumed new identities in distant cities, or started afresh in hidden corners of the world. These rare success stories offered hope to others within the palace, proving that freedom could be achieved. Yet for most, such dreams remained unrealized, fading within the palace's shadowed walls. The pursuit of escape and freedom was perhaps the only meaningful element in the lives of male concubines. It kept their spirits alive and prevented total loss of identity. Every successful escape echoed quietly as a victory within the palace, a symbol of resistance. Thus, the lives of male concubines were a continuous struggle against both the palace's merciless rules and their own internal worlds. Escape and freedom were occasionally attainable, but for most, they remained mere dreams. The years spent within the palace's stone walls enslaved their bodies, yet could not fully extinguish the flicker of hope in their souls. That flicker of hope became their most precious treasure and the strongest source of resilience. The lives of male concubines were not merely a tragedy confined within the palace walls. They were also a product of the social structures and cultural norms of the time. In ancient Japan, social hierarchy and family systems heavily restricted individual freedoms. The placement of young boys into the service of the palace and elite classes was not only to fulfill their master's desires, but also served as a mechanism to maintain the rigid rules of society. In the eyes of society, male concubines were often regarded as invisible beings. They were seen merely as servants attending to the palace's needs, their value and rights as human beings frequently ignored. This societal neglect intensified their social isolation and psychological trauma. Few recognized their suffering, and even fewer could understand the depth of the tragedy they endured. Historians examining the role of male concubines often focus on the daily functioning of the palace and its political balances, yet these analyses frequently overlook the emotional and physical suffering experienced by the concubines themselves. Within the palace hierarchy, male concubines were reduced to instruments serving their master's desires, their individual identities and emotional needs completely disregarded. From a modern historical perspective, this situation can be re-evaluated. Today, the experiences of male concubines are recognized as examples of forced separation at a young age, sexual and physical abuse. Psychologically, they endured trauma, loss of identity, and prolonged isolation. Modern historical and psychological studies demonstrate that male concubines were not merely historical figures, but also victims of serious human rights violations. The legacy of male concubines continues to spark discussion in contemporary society. Their stories offer lessons on power, authority, and gender-based inequality. The oppression and violence they endured throughout history provide significant insights for modern conversations on gender justice and human rights. Historical texts and contemporary interpretations carry forward their silent resistance, escape attempts, and struggles for freedom into the present day. The modern reflections of palace life are also evident through art, literature, and cinema. Films, novels, and theatrical works portray the tragedies of male concubines, the palace's complex social structures, and the psychological damage inflicted upon them. These works amplify their silent cries, making visible the pain that history often ignored. Historians and sociologists study the cultural and social norms of the time to understand the suffering of male concubines. Palace hierarchies, power structures, and societal expectations directly shaped their lives. Male concubines were not only representatives of a generation, but also reflections of the dynamics of power and cultural values in society. For this reason, they are viewed not simply as a social class or duty, but as symbols of tragedies that tested the limits of the human spirit. In the modern world, the stories of male concubines are considered a legacy from which lessons must be drawn. Their psychological and physical traumas serve as crucial warnings concerning children's rights, sexual abuse, and forced labor today. History should guide us to remember the experiences of male concubines, understand their suffering, and prevent similar tragedies from recurring. Thus, the story of male concubines is not only a tragedy confined to the palace walls, it is also a lesson ignored by society, culture, and history that continues to resonate in the modern world. Their suffering, quests for freedom, internal conflicts, and rare stories of escape remain enduring legacies that have transcended time and continue to reach us today.